All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this talk, Adding Spice, How the Chili Pepper Flavored Chinese Culture. My name is David Fields, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies. If you are at this event, it is more than likely that you will also be interested in other events our center does. So I encourage you to visit us at eastasia.wisc.edu to see a list of upcoming events that we have for the remaining of the semester. We have a number of really good events coming up, especially on November 2nd. We have an event with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Ian Johnson on the resurgence of religion in modern China, which is going to be very exciting. If you are an undergraduate, our center offers an undergraduate certificate in East Asian Studies. If you are a grad student, we offer a PhD minor in East Asian Studies. If you're a faculty member, we offer affiliation with our center. And if you're a member of the community, we offer many events just like this. So please check us out at eastasia.wisc.edu. And I would now like to welcome Professor Joseph Dennis, Professor of Chinese History in the History Department, to introduce our speaker today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dennis.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming out. I'm really excited to have Brian Dott come and give this talk. I think it's going to be a terrific talk. Professor Dott is the chair of the Asian Studies program at Whitman College. He's a professor in the Department of History. He's published 2 books, one on chili peppers, which came out from Columbia University Press in 2020, and another on pilgrimages to Mount Tai in late imperial China, which came out from Harvard, when was it, about 10 years ago?
Yeah, about a little more, yeah.
A little while ago. And one of the reasons I'm really excited that he's here is we've had some interaction over time. And actually, I went to the University of Wisconsin as an undergraduate, and my first college course was taught by his father, Evolution of the Earth. And so he's a Madisonian, but he went to the University of Michigan and then got his PhD at Pittsburgh, and is now living in the state of Washington and doing a lot of really interesting research. So welcome, Professor Dott, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. All right, glad to be back in Madison and have had a chance to interact with a few people I know, or at least should remember from when I was very little. And so today I'm going to be talking about chili pepper in China. So what got me interested in this topic, I was in Beijing in a Sichuan restaurant eating food, including lots of chili peppers, and knowing that the chili pepper originated in the Americas, I asked myself, so how did the Chinese start eating this food item that has such a distinct and intense flavor? And so that started me on a very long process of researching the chili pepper in China. So, basically one of the questions I was asking is, how did chilies come to be used daily in China? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The sort of general answer to that is that the Chinese recognized the versatility of the chili pepper, and that it wasn't just something you used to flavor food. You could use it in other ways as well. And then as it gets integrated into Chinese culture, it starts influencing other aspects of that culture, not just the cuisine, not just medicine. So this may look like a long outline. I won't spend a lot of time on each of these, but hopefully you'll, if there's particular areas you'd like me to elaborate more on, I'm happy to do so in the question and answer section after I've finished talking. So I'll do just a brief background on the chili pepper, and then you'll elaborate on a theory about how it got to China. It turns out to not be something that I could determine as concretely as I was hoping I would be able to at the beginning of the project. Thinking about how it was used initially by elites as a decorative plant, how it becomes important as a flavoring, then uses in medicine, and then I'll talk about its how it gets used in other aspects of Chinese culture as well. All right, so background, the chili pepper is indigenous to Central America and Northern South America, spreads pretty early on into the Caribbean, but it is not anywhere outside of the Americas until Columbus. So I like to say there is something positive Columbus did, and that was, I mean, other things too, but moving the chili pepper, a very important one. So he probably brought the chili pepper back to Spain in 1494, so probably not till his second voyage. Initial use in Spain, it does not take off for a while yet as a flavoring. Its primary use is actually as a decorative plant primarily in monasteries. And then from there, we know it gets to Goa in India. So the Portuguese are sailing around Africa into the Indian Ocean basin, introduce the chili pepper into Goa. It spreads from Goa into other parts of India, also via land from India into Southeast Asia, but also probably spreading via ship into Southeast Asia. We know it gets to Malacca, which is a really important trade center at this period. It's now part of Indonesia, probably in around 1540. From there, it gets a little murkier and harder to pinpoint. It's going to spread. It spread from there northward. It's going to get into places like Vietnam and the Philippines. But it can also get spread across the Pacific. So the Portuguese are the ones who are primarily moving it into the Indian Ocean basin and into Southeast Asia from this direction. The Spanish are going to bring it over from Navidad and Acapulco on the Pacific coast of Mexico across the Pacific and end up in their colony in Manila in the Philippines. And these are going to be the so-called Manila galleons that are moving a lot of silver from Peru and Mexico across to East Asia, but they're also bringing other stuff with them. One of the things that's important, you can see on the bottom here, chilies were not a world trade commodity until the 20th century. And that is one of the reasons why I wasn't able to trace the movement of chili peppers as precisely as I had been hoping to be able to do at the beginning of the project. So, you know, if, for example, you wanted to look at this time period at the movement of black pepper or nutmeg or cinnamon from the Spice Islands to Europe, you can do so pretty minutely because there's ship records that show how many crates of each of those things were in the cargo hold of a particular ship when it arrived in the Netherlands and then where they sold it to in other places. That is not true for the chili pepper. Columbus really hoped that he'd be able to, everybody would suddenly want to buy ships full of chili peppers in Europe and he could become super rich. But that did not pan out for him. And instead, we don't have crates of chilies moving out of the Americas. And we don't get that sort of large trade of chili peppers until the 20th century. So I think probably what happened is, particularly if you look at the crews on the ships who were moving from Mexico to Manila, There's indigenous peoples on those crews, there's mestizos on those crews, there's Spanish on those crews, and a lot of them were eating chili peppers. And so they brought them with them in order to eat them on the voyage, and then either intentionally or accidentally spread the seeds at various places that they stopped. And so probably the chili pepper is going to be moving via Chinese merchants who are trading either in Vietnam or the Philippines or both places, and then taking them over to China and probably getting there in the 1570s. Based on my research and the research of some Chinese historians studying chili peppers, it seems pretty likely that chili peppers are actually introduced into China 3 different places, and probably at 3 different times. So the earliest known reference of chili peppers dates to 1591, and that is on that central coastal area of China. If you think about it, that's, just under 100 years after Columbus's first voyage. And so for this time period, that's pretty remarkably fast for this plant to move essentially all the way around the world. And it is known in Chinese as fanjiao, or foreign pepper, in that area. And the different names are one of the strongest evidences for the idea that it is being introduced separately in different areas. So it's introduced, this map, unfortunately, apologies, David, doesn't have the Korean Peninsula. That's right here. So this is borders on Korea, and the pepper here was introduced from Korea. And the pepper there was introduced from Japan to Korea, into Shenjing, this northeastern part of China. And it initially is called chin pepper. And that is just a sign that we've got a separate introduction. They're using a different name. They're having to invent a name for this new plant. And then in Taiwan, it's almost certainly introduced there by the Dutch, who were in Taiwan for a short period of time. And there it's known as foreign ginger. And there, part of the naming regimen that's going on here is, yes, ginger has an intense flavor. The name that we're translating from Chinese as pepper I'll get to it in a minute, but it also has an intense flavor. It's a native plant for China. And you're adding a modifier onto it to help identify it. In this case, it's helping to identify probably how you would use it. So you'd use it in a similar way that you're using the native Sichuan pepper for, or in a similar way that you're using ginger as a flavoring. All right. So in the written records, the earliest use we see for the elite, who of course are the ones who are writing, was as a decorative plant. So it's an interesting parallel with the initial use of it in Spain. And so the example I have here is the earliest written text. It's by Gaulian, dates to 1591. And he has this huge compendium of a text that's divided into 8 different sections. And he's writing about all sorts of different things. But he's very interested in prolonging life. He's very interested in Taoism. And he's trying to look at things like food, like medicine, as a way of trying to encourage people for better living. This is his description. It's a fairly straightforward, somewhat botanical description of the chili pepper. So foreign pepper, this is the name that he's using for it. Clearly an understanding that it's a newly introduced plant. The plant has dense growth. The flowers are white. The fruits look just like the worn out tip of a writing brush. So he's using a very scholarly metaphor. Their flavor is spicy, la. Their color is red. They are very pleasing to look at. Propagation results from planting the seeds, as opposed to doing a cutting of the plant. And so, yes, he is acknowledging that the flavor is spicy. He understands that. But particularly, I want to emphasize that line, they are very pleasing to look at. Because even though it's not super emphasized in this description, it is emphasized by where he placed it in his big volume of books. And that is in a section on decorative plants. And it is not in the sections where he's talking about food, and it is not in the sections when he's talking about medicine. So for him, I see this as clearly he's envisioning this thing as a very decorative plant. And I just want to point out that particularly if we look at like an example like this, where you've got the bright red, shiny fruit. Red is a celebratory color in Chinese culture. Shiny and red is great. Wedding dresses were often made out of red silk. Red, polished red coral was very popular decorative feature in scholars' studios. And so the contrast, particularly of you've got this bright red fruit against really dark green leaves, it's just a really pleasant combination, and it makes a lot of sense that we get this emphasis on it as the aesthetics and as a decorative plant. And then these are just a couple examples of later texts describing it as a decorative plant. So people put them in pots as decorations. They are shiny and radiant. Many are raised in pots for decoration. And then I'll just do a quick mention of a very contemporary use of the chili peppers. And this is a very, I think this might be actually a 21st century use of chili peppers, decorative in China. So you're putting up strings of chili peppers on either side of the door in this concept of the Chinese phrase is hong hong huo huo. It literally means red, red, fire, fire. But more figuratively, it's a prayer for an exuberant and prosperous life. And these are typically hung outside of, in this case, this is a small hotel or an inn, but you can also hang them on either side of the entrance to a home. And they're typically put up at Chinese New Year's time. So we sort of have a return to the chili pepper for its aesthetic value and an emphasis on the celebratoriness of its shininess and its redness. All right, so moving on to thinking about the chili pepper as a flavoring, which of course is its most important aspect of how it's used in China, both in the late imperial period and in contemporary times. But initially, when it first arrives and it's being used as a flavoring, it seemed to have gotten its sort of toehold into Chinese cuisine by being used as a substitute for other flavorings. And so there's a series of those I want to look at. And so we've got an interesting parallel here in Chinese and in English, as well as some of the other European languages, where this term pepper is being applied to different plants that are completely unrelated to each other. So for the English, that's deriving from Latin, and it's for describing black pepper. So the core earliest meaning for pepper in European languages and in English is coming from black pepper. For the Chinese, it's coming from an indigenous plant the Sichuan pepper, sometimes also known as flower pepper or fagara. It's a completely separate plant from the chili pepper. It is Xanthoxylum bungianum. It's a small tree. It's actually the prickly ash tree, so there are actually relatives of it native in the Americas. It has the covering for the seeds is the flavoring. It's the seed pod that has the flavoring, the pericarp of the plant. And it has a distinctive pungent flavor, but it also has a numbing aspect. So when you chew it, your tongue and your gums go slightly numb. And so it's a very unique flavoring. So if you originally, this Chinese character, jiao, by itself meant this indigenous plant. And then we'll start seeing the other spicy things coming into China, then use that as the base. Black pepper arrives long before the chili pepper, but it also is not indigenous to China. It's indigenous to South Asia, India, and Sri Lanka. Again, a completely separate plant from either, it's completely separate plant family from either Sichuan pepper or the chili pepper. It's a vine, and it is typically it's the whole seed that's used for the black peppercorn. I'll just point out that traditionally in China, they typically take off the outer coating of this around the seed, and so you grind just the seed. You get a whiter color for it. So the black and white of the pepper that we're used to is a combination of that ground up outer coating around the seed and then the seed itself. So black pepper is a good description for us, but not such a good description of it in Chinese. And the Chinese call that hujiao, and hu is another word for foreign. It typically means things coming from the West, particularly could include India. And so it's the pepper from India to distinguish it from the native Sichuan pepper or flower pepper, huajiao. And so when the chili pepper arrives, the Chinese continue this naming regimen, borrowing that character from the native pungent plant and then modifying it in order to distinguish it from the native plant. And so fanjiao is one of the early names for it. For fan is another word that means foreign. And then la jiao, or spicy pepper, becomes the more and more common name for the chili pepper. So initially, the chili pepper is being substituted for both of these other peppers. So the sort of three main rivals, two of them are these other peppers, and they're in the Chinese classification of flavors, they're all in the same flavor group. They're all in the same pungent flavor group. And so it's sort of a natural substitution. So Sichuan pepper is indigenous. It's widely available in the markets, but because it's a small tree, most people wouldn't grow it themselves because they usually only have like a small vegetable plot that they're devoting for flavors for their own, for eating themselves. And so generally speaking, since you're purchasing it, even though it's native plant, it's still gonna cost something. And so it's still gonna be more expensive than just growing a chili pepper in your vegetable or kitchen garden. Obviously, you've got labor input there, but you don't have to put out any sort of cash for it. And so we've got this fairly early example of a local history that says that the chili pepper can be substituted for Sichuan pepper. And so we have that sort of parallel use between the two of them. And we get a similar thing for the black pepper. And again, this is actually imported into China, so it's more expensive. And the places in China where it's most often being referred to as a substitute, the chili pepper as a substitute for black pepper, are areas on the interior in China. So black pepper is going to arrive via ship from South Asia. Obviously, it's still expensive when it enters the port cities along the Chinese coast, but the price is going to go up as it moves inland. And so it's going to be even more expensive inland, and that is that economy, the economics of substituting it, the chili pepper for this more expensive black pepper, make a lot of sense, especially when we're looking in the interior. So we can see here, when ground very fine, chili peppers are used in the winter months as a substitute for black pepper. So the other thing that chili peppers initially get used to substitute for is salt. Now, salt is a completely separate flavor group in China. And so it's not as natural to be able to substitute a spicy thing for a salty thing. What's going on here is, again, it's economics coming into play. So salt is partially government controlled, and that artificially sets the price higher. And then I think very importantly for the spread of the popularity of the chili pepper is that in the 1620s, there are some very major disruptions in salt production, but especially in salt distribution. And those led to extremely high price increases in salt. And so people can't afford to buy as much salt. They're looking for something to substitute. Again, it's not a perfect substitute, but it does provide flavor, and it works as a substitute for salt. Now, one thing that's important to point out here is that salt, of course, serves, especially sodium, serves a very important biological function in humans. We have to have some, but almost, the vast majority of the salt that we consume is not necessary biologically. And so the chili pepper cannot substitute for that need, the biological need, but it can substitute for that other portion of what salt's being used for, which is as a flavoring. Okay, and then over time, people start just liking the flavor of chili peppers themselves. And that heat, the capsaicin, that's the element in the chili peppers that gives them, that causes us to react to that, to the chili pepper. It releases various things and endorphins. There's all sorts of stuff that can eventually become pleasurable, maybe not your initial introduction to the chili pepper, but over time it can be something that people really want to have. And so we get over time people wanting the flavoring, and it's important to remember that they're selecting and breeding different varieties of chili pepper, not just for the heat, but also for flavors. And so it's important to remember it's not just the heat they're striving for, but there are lots of different varieties of chili peppers that have different flavors, that add different things to different dishes. So we get the ground fruit is put into food. It is extremely pungent and spicy. The pod is sliced and used to flavor food in sauces, vinegar, savory oils, and preserved vegetables. What we're seeing there in that second one, those are all really important ways that Chinese food traditionally is flavored. And the fact that chili peppers are getting introduced into all of those different aspects of, oils, vinegars, sauces, is showing how well it is becoming integrated into the culinary traditions in China. And then we get even more intensification of the use of chili pepper. It becomes as indispensable in daily cuisine as onion and garlic. It is the most important vegetable in the garden. And so this is happening over the course of the 18th century. By the time we're into the 19th century, it's very rare to find a source that's talking about the chili pepper as a substitute. And they've just become something that people are using because they want to use chili peppers. So over time, this introduction of the chili pepper begins to modify the Chinese language itself. And the meaning of this term la, or spicy, changes, and it becomes more and more associated with the chili pepper. So if we look in the 17th century, it's that character la means 新香, very pungent, and that is connected with scallions, garlic, knotweed, mustard, those sorts of plants. But not obviously, the chili pepper hasn't yet taken off, and it is not there. You have to come fairly recently. I haven't exhaustively searched all the dictionaries, but it's definitely prevalent in the 1990s. But it's also at the end of the list. So they keep the other ones, the sharp and stimulating flavor of ginger, garlic, or chili pepper. And then more recently, in some 21st century dictionaries, the chili pepper has moved to the front of that list, really emphasizing the direct association with this term la with the chili pepper. And there's a number of phrases in modern Chinese, 我想吃辣, or 我不吃辣的, or 我怕辣. That yes, those phrases could mean something besides the chili pepper, but largely people are saying these sorts of things, they're usually referring to the chili pepper. Whereas, of course, if you said this, a couple of hundred years ago, it might mean garlic or ginger or something else that you didn't want to eat or you did want to eat. But now it's really directly associated with the chili pepper. It's important to point out that the chili peppers, it's a sort of, technically they are a fruit, but they're treated as a vegetable, not just as a flavoring. You might be using different varieties, and typically when they're treated as a vegetable, they're usually being eaten fresh rather than dried or ground up. And it's important to point out that that is the most common category of classification in historical texts that are dividing things into categories. The chili pepper is most often in the vegetable section. And then I just got a couple examples here. In his 1848 work on plants, Wei Chujun observed that chilies are grown in Jiangxi, Hunan, Guizhou, and Sichuan as vegetables. So that their usage extends beyond their use as a flavoring, and people are actually eating them, often raw, but certainly fresh as opposed to dried. And then this is actually a poster. This is from Shanxi. And so regional cuisines vary considerably around China, and regional culture varies around China. And we get these, typically they're things you're supposed to buy as a tourist, but largely it's the Chinese tourists domestically within China who would be buying these sorts of things. And you can buy the 8 strange things from a particular province. strange isn't the best translation. It sort of the things that make this regional culture unique. And so one of them in this case is the chili pepper, and it describes here the chili pepper is the main dish as opposed to being just a flavoring. And so that's emphasizing, again, its value as a vegetable, not just as a flavor. All right, so I want to touch a little bit on the chili pepper as medicine. So the Chinese traditional medicine recognized a number of properties in the chili pepper. And again, largely what they're relying on for these treatments would be the capsaicin, that compound within chili peppers that gives them that heat, that spiciness. So I'm going to start off very, very briefly talking about the 5 phases. So within Chinese culture, the 5 phases are very, very important, and they're a really important component within the traditional Chinese medicine system. And in that, you can divide all sorts of things into 5 categories. So these are just a few of them here. You can have the 5 directions. The Chinese add the center as a 5th direction. You have colors. You have the 5 flavors. You have different climates. You have different types of internal organs. You have different other parts of the body that are associated with different parts of these, with one or more, one of these phases. And then if your body's out of phase, then perhaps you're lacking in one of these, or you have too much of one of these. And so you would improve the health by prescribing something that's either going to increase the amount of one of these phases or decrease the one that you have too much of. So while it's really important that the Chinese recognize and classify new plants in order to then start using them within these sorts of systems, it's also not at all surprising where the chili pepper gets placed, right? So it gets put in the pungent flavor category, and because of that, it's then associated as having a drying ability. It's connected with the lungs, it's connected with the nose, the skin, the large intestine. And so we can see how this understanding of how it connects with this system, then Chinese medical practitioners can then prescribe it for different things. So here's a really good example. Wang Fu's medical text from the middle of the 18th century. He says the chili pepper, the pungent flavor drains off the lungs. And so we can see actually 3 of those aspects of we've got the pungent category, has that drying ability, and is focusing on the lungs. And then this is another example. Without variety in the diet, illnesses can occur. Lesser ones can be treated with ginger and cassia cinnamon, so they're both in that same pungent category. More severe illnesses of the spleen or stomach must be treated with something stronger, the foreign pepper. So there's this different understanding of how you're using the chili peppers within that system of the 5 phases. Just to touch on, there's another important system within Chinese traditional medicine, which is the yin-yang system. We can also think of that as a temperature system. So all things, either biological or geological, have heating or cooling tendencies, characteristics, and all bodies have both in them, both yin and yang. So yin is often seen as more female, yang is more male, but a male body has both elements. with a preponderance of yang, female bodies, a preponderance of yin, but still has yang. So we need a balance of these two. And so another way of thinking about some aspects of illness are related to a particular person's body going out of balance of what is normal for them. And so if they're now too hot, then you would want to prescribe something that's going to be more cooling and vice versa. And again, this is no surprise. Chili peppers are in the warming category. There are also times where they want to be more precise, and you can develop further gradations. The chili pepper is always at the extreme end of any of these gradations. Again, not surprising, but it's still important for it to be written down and recognized so that people can be using it in prescriptions. So here's another example of this yin and yang aspect for the chili peppers. The chili pepper has the property of cold expelling heat. It has great pungent and warming properties, and thus can cure those with yang wind hemorrhoid sores. It guides fire to move downward. So it's this heating aspect of the chili pepper. Even though the chili has a hot characteristic, it can expel heat. Wujuyu has this same effect. So this is, I sort of think about this as like fighting fire with fire. You're using that heat to reduce heat. It seems sort of counterintuitive, but they're using here an example of a plant that would have been very widely known by practitioners of Chinese traditional medicine, and using that as a way of explaining how do you use this new plant? I don't know how to use this new plant. And they're like, well, you can, in this case, you can use it just like you would use wujuyu. So it's a useful way of introducing the plant by comparing it to something that they'd be more familiar with. All right, the other thing that's important is so that understand how they can place the chili pepper into their pre-existing systems. It's also important to realize that they also observed what happened when people ate chili peppers and could then think about, okay, based on that, then I can use the chili pepper for treating this thing or that thing, not just always going with one of these more prescriptive structured systems. And so one of the things I see most commonly in the sources about chili peppers is that they aid in digestion and that they stimulate the appetite. And it's important we can look at modern sort of biomedicine analyses of the chili pepper and particularly of capsaicin, and they find similar things. So one of the things that capsaicin does is stimulate salivation, and that is essentially the first step in digestion. And then capsaicin stimulates the production of gastric juices in the stomach, which is obviously also a part of digestion. And stimulating both of those things can also stimulate the appetite. So it looks like, they're very real things that they're observing, and then can use the chili pepper to help treat if somebody has lost their appetite. Then you could give them chili peppers to eat to help stimulate that. Capsaicin is recognized in these sources as well as, again, modern biomedical studies as having fairly strong antimicrobial abilities. So they can kill bacteria, they can kill viruses, they can kill fungus. And here we have the example of a place where they eat a lot of seafood and using the chili pepper as a mechanism, both sort of as a prophylactic or as a means of treating a particular ailment. So chili pepper can detoxify poison from aquatic animals. People who eat too much fish or crab and get diarrhea or dropsy can boil the fruit to make a dose of medicinal broth. And another thing that's important to understand I mean, this is true of lots of indigenous medical systems and more true of our modern medical understanding, is in this traditional system, you can't separate food that's going into the body as food versus food that's going into the body as medicine. Both of them are impacting a person's health. And so when we're talking here about a medicinal broth, but they're essentially making a dish out of chili pepper, but using it medicinally. And of course, if you're eating chili peppers as a flavoring, they're still gonna have that biological impact as well. I don't know if I would try this one, but they can be used as essentially as an analgesic, in this case for snake bite. I love the preciseness. Chew 11 or 12 raw spicy eggplant. This is another Chinese name. And interestingly, are recognizing that the chili pepper is in the same family as the eggplant. Chew 11 or 12 raw spicy eggplant fruits to reduce swelling and stop pain. Or masticate and place directly on the wound to reduce swelling and stop pain. All right, so now I'm gonna just quickly touch on the chili pepper as it takes off as a flavoring, as a vegetable, as a medicine. It starts becoming more and more prevalent within the culture, and we can see it in other places as well. So we've got some literary images, and then I'll talk a little bit about some gendered tropes that become associated with the chili pepper. So the very first literary reference to chili pepper comes quite early in Tang Shenzhu's opera, The Peony Pavilion. And there it becomes associated with the main female protagonist of that opera. And we can sort of say that Bridal Dew, this is one translation of her name, is the sort of first example of the female gender trope of a la Meizi, or spicy girl, spicy young women. This is also something that we can see in the very famous 18th century novel, Dream of the Red Chamber. Again, it's not pervasive at all. So in the Peony Pavilion, there's one mention of chili pepper, but I take what I can get. In the Dream of the Red Chamber, there's just a handful of references to it. One of the things where it occurs, it's connected with this strong female character, Wang Shifeng. And her nickname is Feng Lazi, which means basically chili pepper feng. And here it's associated directly with her personality. She is seen as very feisty, independent. She has been placed in charge of this extraordinarily wealthy family's finances, daily finances. And so a lot of trust has been placed in her, largely because of that sort of outgoing, feisty nature. And that is where that nickname is coming from. That sort of the spiciness of the pepper is being used as her nickname because of the spiciness of her character. And that is that trope then gets carried forward as well. Whoops. I just want to point out, this is one of my favorite Chinese paintings of the chili pepper. It's sort of mid 20th century Chinese artist, Ye Qianyu. And this is his portrait of Wang Shifeng. So her portrait is as a chili pepper, which also, I just want to point out, looks a lot like a writing brush. And so there's this interesting parallels we can see there. But he is very directly drawing on that aspect of her character and pulling out her nickname in his portrait of her. There's a super, I mean, it's probably not popular anymore, but there's a popular song that comes out in the late 20th century and carries over into the early part of the 21st century called La Meizi. And this is, again, spicy girls, spicy young women. In this case, it's particularly associated with women from Hunan, a place where a lot of chilies are consumed. And so the character of the women from there is seen as being influenced by the fact that they're eating a lot of chili peppers. And so you can look this up on YouTube. You can get play the music video version of it. A lot of women making a lot of chili sauce. And these are just a few key phrases from the song, emphasizing that parallel between the sort of gendered stereotypes for women from Hunan and associating them with the chili pepper. So from youth, unafraid of spice, with a handful of chilies, they speak their minds. Passion, their passion is spicy. When they speak, it's fiery and spicy. When they do things, it's bold and spicy. And when they interact with others, it's hot and spicy. And yes, there are sexual innuendos in the song, but it's also it's not just that. It's about sort of practical interactions or less sexual interactions as well. And then there's also some gendered tropes, male gendered tropes associated with the chili peppers. These are not as prevalent as the female ones, but they're largely associated with Chairman Mao. And so Chairman Mao from Hunan and ate a lot of chilies and loved chilies. And there's references to him when he ate his watermelon, he would actually sprinkle dried flakes of chili pepper on the watermelon. And he associated the ability to eat spiciness with male virility, particularly male militancy. And the ability, he has this phrase that he has to eat chili peppers. And if he can't eat, then he can't act. And if he couldn't have acted, then there would not have been a revolution. And this is usually then seen as, it's slightly misquoted, but the phrase is very, very prevalent all the way up to the present. Without the chili pepper, there would have been no revolution. I think Mao would like that different interpretation of it. He used it more personally, but that is sort of the point he was trying to make, that ability to eat spiciness made more capable military leaders like himself. And so that's where that parallel comes in. I'll just very, very briefly mention that one of the things that allows the chili to take off is that it is adaptable to regional cultures and regional practices. And so the way it's used in Trenzhou for curing fish poisoning is not the way it's going to be used in the Northwest or in Sichuan. And instead, you get other places like Guangxi, Guangdong, where they're often using it as both a prophylactic and as a treatment for malaria. And those are places where malaria is more prevalent. And then in Sichuan, Hunan, Guizhou, the ability, that sort of drying capability of the chili pepper to expel excess moisture in these very humid places is really important. And that is one of the reasons why people from those regions eat a lot of chili peppers. And I'll just leave you with this nice, tantalizing food image. So my emphasis is that the chili pepper is important to understand. One of the reasons it becomes, it becomes so popular in China is not just because it gets used as a flavoring, but because it gets used in these other variety of different ways, including medicine, including as a vegetable. And then as its popularity takes off, it can carry these sort of cultural symbolic aspects also. It influence the language. And then important to realize that it's used differently in different parts of China. And that people are able to, because of the versatility of the chili pepper, able to pull out how they want to use it and match it to their regional culture and not just have it being used exactly the same everywhere else. So thank you very much, and I'd love to hear some questions.